right, let's jump straight in. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a massive, systemic gridlock happening right now in California's cell and gene therapy ecosystem, what we usually just call CGT. We're going to break down exactly why these incredible early-stage cures for severe diseases are essentially stalling out, and more importantly, how we can engineer a bridge to actually fix the problem.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. First, the paradox of plenty. Second, diagnosing the valley. Third, scaling biology versus silicon. And finally, the 3 pillars of infrastructure.
Okay, Section 1, the paradox of plenty. Let's dive right into this glaring contradiction sitting at the very heart of the world's absolute top biotechnology hub.
So you're probably familiar with this overarching concept. It's known as the Valley of Death. In the cell and gene therapy world, we see an incredibly high volume of early-stage academic discoveries. I mean, novel targets, absolutely amazing early science happening on the left side. But when it comes time to actually scale those innovations into commercial therapies for real patients on the right, the bridge is just completely broken. They fall right into the chasm. They utterly fail to scale.
Now, what's really wild here is the massive contrast between the inputs and the outputs. Just look at the input side. California boasts 50% of all U.S. biotech venture capital funding. They've got $3.5 billion in state subsidies and 15 early-stage academic GMP facilities. These are literally world-class inputs, and yet the outputs are fundamentally broken. Small and medium enterprises, our SMEs, are absolutely starving for clinical batches, and they're facing massive 15 to 18-month delays at the FDA. Section 2, diagnosing the valley. Let's break down the exact friction points that are causing this massive commercialization gap.
We can basically categorize the collapse of this bridge into 3 structural failures. First up, ecosystem fragmentation. All the players exist, sure, but they're operating in completely isolated silos. Second is a severe cost and funding mismatch, where capital actively avoids building any real infrastructure. And third, extreme regulatory friction that's just holding the entire industry back.
To really wrap your head around that capital mismatch, you have to understand this one critical number, $50 million. That is the staggering absolute baseline cost required just to build a proper GMP or good manufacturing practice facility. For a small biotech startup that maybe just scraped together a $2 or $3 million grant, this $50 million threshold is a massive brick wall. They simply cannot cross it.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates why those SMEs are left stranded. Venture capitalists, by their nature, are highly motivated to seek fast returns, right? They want to fund preclinical data, early R&D, those flashy research papers. They actively treat that $50 million GMP infrastructure requirement like a toxic liability on their balance sheets. They do not want to fund concrete and steel. They want to fund science. And because of that, our SMEs are stranded without the physical infrastructure they desperately need to even reach phase 1 clinical trials.
Then, you add regulatory friction into the mix. So, in California, standard commercial submissions to the FDA usually take around 12 to 14 months. But academic and California submissions, they're getting hit with a super painful 15 to 18-month delay. That extra 3 to 6 months is basically an academic quality assurance penalty.
The real-world story behind that delay is actually kind of fascinating. You see, university professors are usually the ones running these academic GM facilities, and they are brilliant scientists, no doubt, but they completely lack commercial, regulatory affairs, and CMC expertise. Because they just don't know the exact, highly specific commercial formatting the FDA demands, they end up submitting inappropriate documentation. So the FDA looks at it, bounces it right back with an immediate rejection, and boom, months of time are completely wasted.
Meanwhile, despite these SMEs desperately starving for manufacturing slots just to make their clinical batches, here's a truly shocking statistic. A massive 65% of private GMP capacity is actually just sitting idle.
So this creates what we call a capacity black hole. Big contract manufacturing organizations, the CDMOs, they reject these small 30-batch clinical cases from SMEs because, frankly, they're just too small to be worth their time. But on the other end of the spectrum, the academic facilities completely max out at producing just 2 or 3 batches. So it leaves SMEs to die waiting for manufacturing slots, all while the vast majority of private GMP capacity in the state remains completely underutilized. It's crazy.
Section 3, scaling biology versus silicon. To truly grasp why this logjam even exists, we need to take a vital contextual detour.
We absolutely cannot treat biotech startups the same way we treat tech startups. On the left here, you have the silicon tech industry. Software and computer chips rely on highly uniform inputs.
If you get it right once, you can scale it exponentially using very predictable models. But on the right, we're dealing with biological cells. Culturing living cells involves entirely bespoke variables and incredibly complex scaling physics. Literally every single batch can behave differently.
Because the broader tech industry relies so heavily on standard exponential scaling, a lot of capital tries to apply that exact same mindset to biology. But achieving just 1 single gram of stable, reproducible living cells operates under completely different physical rules. Forcing standard tech startup scaling models onto complex biological manufacturing, it guarantees failure every single time. You just can't scale biology like a mobile phone.
So when you combine all these factors, you get this massive gridlock matrix. Everyone in the space has incredible capabilities, but their motivations are just completely misaligned. VCs want fast returns. Big CDMOs want pharma scale, massive batches. Academic GNPs are focused on fulfilling research and completely lack regulatory knowledge. The end result? Our SME biotechs are left totally paralyzed, right in the middle, stranded without the capacity or the infrastructure to move forward.
Which brings us to Section 4, 3 pillars of infrastructure. Let's shift gears here from diagnosing the problem to looking at the actual structural blueprint to fix this and rewire the whole ecosystem.
The very first mindset shift requires a pretty strong metaphor. We have to stop splashing water. Right now, states give out isolated $2 to $3 million grants to individual SMEs. But as we just established, they can't buy a $50 million facility with that. It's a death sentence. Capital absolutely must pivot away from funding isolated companies and instead fund load-bearing connective infrastructure. We need shared connective tissue that links these SMEs directly to that idle capacity we talked about. Here is Pillar 1 of that blueprint: professionalizing quality management systems and regulatory affairs. We need to take regulatory submissions off the plates of academic professors. By establishing a dedicated, highly professionalized translation layer of commercial experts, we can seamlessly convert that academic R&D into perfectly FDA-compliant documentation. That completely eliminates those nasty 3 to 6 month penalty delays.
Pillar 2 addresses the actual humans doing the work. Look, we have a severe national crisis in talent right now. There simply aren't enough trained people to handle this level of complex biology. We need to directly fund highly targeted co-op programs and internships that focus specifically on the tightest operational bottlenecks, things like T-cell processing, iPSC handling, and GMP quality control.
And Pillar 3 is the final connective piece, a centralized capacity clearinghouse. To actually unlock that 65% of idle private capacity, we need a centralized information and operations hub. This hub would actively play matchmaker, pairing the clinical batch demands of small SMEs with the available supply that's just sitting totally empty in private and academic GMPs. It optimizes utilization across the entire state.
When you bring all 3 of these pillars together, it beautifully rewires the ecosystem for commercial scale. The paradox of plenty is ultimately an engineering problem. It's not a resource problem. By shifting investment away from isolated assets and moving it toward this systemic, connective infrastructure, professionalized translation, targeted talent, and a centralized clearinghouse, we literally construct the exact load-bearing bridge needed to finally cross the valley of death. Which leaves us with this final, pretty provocative thought. California's struggles? They are a microcosm of the entire biotech world. So how can other global biotech hubs apply this exact diagnostic to bridge their own commercialization valleys of death? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this structured look at the CGT ecosystem has empowered you with a fresh understanding of what it actually takes to bring the cures of tomorrow to patients today. Until next time, keep learning.